Welcome to another Bio 151 lecture. Can you believe it's your last lecture for the semester? I feel like it flew by. A few announcements before we get started. Your homework for Sapling Chapter 48 is due on Sunday, but I highly suggest that you complete it before your exam that you have this week. Office hours will be on Tuesday from 1 to 3. There are no office hours on Thursday because that's when you will be taking your exam. As always, I'm also available via email, or you can post on our class discussion board. Today, our lecture is going to be focusing on human impacts on the environment. And humans impact the environment in many different ways, and a lot of different organisms are affected, such as snow leopards, which are an endangered species. We suspect there's about 6,000 of them left in the wild. Snow leopards are one of the smallest big cats in the world, and they live in very harsh, snowy, rugged, mountainous regions in Central and South Asia across 12 different countries. They're found at very high elevations, and their ideal habitat is bleak, dangerous, and cold. But with global warming, a lot of their habitat is starting to disappear, and so it's going to be harder and harder for snow leopards, which are already endangered, to survive. Another organism that is affected by us warming the planet are sea turtles. The sex of a sea turtle is determined by the temperature of the sand incubating the eggs. Warmer temperatures, over 29 degrees Celsius, produce females. Cooler temperatures produce males. Over 99% of turtle hatchlings in northern Australia have been female the past few years due to increasing sand and sea temperatures, which will make it difficult for the species to survive if there's no males for the females to mate with. So what is the Anthropocene? The Anthropocene is the modern era, and it's emphasizing the dominant impact of humans on Earth. Our planet had about 500 million human inhabitants when Christopher Columbus set sail in 1942. Now we have over 7 billion people, and you can see here that since the Industrial Revolution, our population, the human population, has grown at an exponential rate, and it's continuing to grow. Our impact on the Earth is partly a consequence of our sheer numbers, which in turn drive our energy and land use. But our impact on the Earth is also reflected by the individual and societal choices we make. So if we look at this figure here, we can see different countries, and on the y-axis, we have kilowatt hours per person per day. And we can see that the energy used by individuals is higher in some countries than in others because of differences in standard of living, greater amounts of travel, and the need to heat buildings in countries at higher latitudes that have more seasonal variation. And you can see here that the United States uses the second most amount of energy out of all these countries, with Canada using the most. Where other countries that are in lower socioeconomic status and more developing nations, such as Bangladesh and Kenya, use very little amounts of energy compared to what we use. And these differences in use can have major impacts on our planet. The concept of the ecological footprint is to attempt to quantify our individual claims on global resources by adding up all the energy, food, material, and services we use, and estimating how much land is required to provide those resources. So you can see in this figure here, the average ecological footprint per person is plotted against the ranking of the Human Development Index, which is a measure of the standard of living maintained by the United Nations for many countries. Developed countries, as you can see here, Denmark, United States, Japan, tend to have large ecological footprints. For the average American, we use about 7 hectares of land to support each person. But in contrast, many parts of Asia and Africa, such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, India, Indonesia, South Africa, they have much lower ecological footprints and in many cases use less than 1 hectare to support the average citizen. And so these differences typically follow how developed your country is. The biocapacity of the earth is its ability to support us. And you can see here that we reached the 1 biocapacity, because we only have 1 earth to live on, in about a little after 1970. Since then, we have continued to use resources on the planet too fast and in too great of numbers, and so we continue to overshoot the Earth's ability to support us. We have overshot Earth's biocapacity by 68%. If all the world consumed resources at the rate of the average American, we would need an equivalent of almost 5 planets to support the 7 billion people living on Earth. So we're using our resources unsustainably right now, which will have major consequences for future generations and for the future of our planet. Humans have become major contributors to the carbon cycle, particularly the part of the cycle in which ancient organic matter, or fossil fuels, is oxidized to carbon dioxide. So when we burn fossil fuels, which are coal, oil, and natural gas, we're releasing that carbon dioxide that is held within that fossil fuel and returning it to the atmosphere. The amount of carbon dioxide that humans add to the atmosphere each year by burning fossil fuels is about 100 times that produced by all of Earth's volcanoes working together. Analyses of air bubbles trapped in glacial ice show that this pattern of persistent increase began earlier with the onset of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. So this increasing fuel consumption is disturbing the balance of photosynthesis and respiration. Another way that we impact the carbon cycle is by deforestation. When land is cleared for agriculture, the existing vegetation is generally burned off in some way, converting much of the organic carbon held in the vegetation into biomass and soil organic matter, and that all gets turned into carbon dioxide. Because we're releasing that and we're removing the plants that would normally take it in during photosynthesis, there's no counteracting process to remove carbon dioxide at comparable rates. Carbon dioxide is only one of several greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And greenhouse gases are gases that absorb infrared radiation released by Earth's surface and then emit energy, warming the surface of our planet and the troposphere, which this process is called the greenhouse effect. Water vapor is another, and so is methane, and you can see a list of other greenhouse gases that we have. Without these gases absorbing and trapping heat, the average surface temperatures would fall below freezing and life would not be possible. So it's important to have these gases in our atmosphere. However, because carbon dioxide is increasing rapidly, its greenhouse effect, or ability to warm the earth, is also increasing. Methane levels are also rising rapidly, in large part because of increasing food production. Most of the methane delivered each year to the atmosphere is generated by methane-producing archaeans, which thrive in the guts of cattle and waterlogged paddies where rice is cultivated. The thawing of permafrost at high latitudes is also releasing additional methane that was trapped in frozen soils when the ice formed long ago. Carbon dioxide has released nearly twice as much warming since the Industrial Revolution than methane, nitrous oxide, and halocarbons combined. We're now going to watch a video about how the greenhouse effect actually works.
The sun emits radiation, some of which reaches the Earth. This radiation is composed of a wide range of wavelengths, but most of the energy is found in visible light. About 30% of the radiation that reaches the Earth's atmosphere is reflected back to space by clouds, aerosols in the atmosphere, or the Earth's surface. Another 20% is absorbed by the atmosphere and clouds, and the remaining 50% is absorbed by the continents and oceans. The absorbed energy warms the surface, and the heat is released back upward as infrared radiation. The infrared radiation is a different wavelength from that of the visible light that hits the Earth's surface. Some of the heat energy goes straight back to space, but some of it is intercepted by molecules such as carbon dioxide and re-radiated in all directions, effectively keeping some of the heat within the atmosphere. The gases that absorb and re-radiate heat, such as carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor, are called greenhouse gases. Without greenhouse gases, the sun's radiation would be insufficient to keep Earth's surface temperature above freezing. However, human activity adds a significant amount of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, trapping more of the sun's re-radiation in the atmosphere and warming our planet.
Okay, hopefully that video was helpful in helping you understand how the greenhouse effect works. For the past century, temperatures have been monitored at weather stations around the world. More recently, satellites in space have measured temperatures in places as remote as the high Arctic and the middle of the ocean. In most parts of the world, the mean annual temperature between 1999 and 2008 was warmer on average than annual temperatures between 1940 through 1980. Overall, Earth's surface temperature has increased by 1 degree Celsius. In some places, that temperature change has been slight, which you can see on this map, where it's a almost white color. That's where there's been very little change in temperature. In other places, especially at high latitudes, that increase has been as much as 2 degrees Celsius, which you can see is especially apparent up near the North Pole, where we've had major warming of the planet. This graph depicts the changes in monthly mean global temperature over the past 70 years. The green line represents temperature modeling using natural inputs and human activities. The blue line represents temperature modeling using only solar and volcano data, so not having any impact from humans. The gray line is the measured monthly mean global temperature, so the actual temperature each month. You can see from this graph that the recorded temperatures can be best explained by the model that has human activities taken into account. There is overwhelming agreement among scientists that atmospheric carbon dioxide levels are rising, that temperature on the planet is increasing, and that the physics of greenhouse gases relate these two effects. Modeling future climatic conditions is difficult because of the many complex interactions that contribute to climate, some of which we talked about last lecture. Using mathematical models that accurately approximate current climate, scientists can change inputs into the model, adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, for example, or changing the extent of forest cover. The model then generates a set of results that can be used to predict future climate. In general, climate models do a pretty good job of explaining global scale features of climate and climatic change. Most climate models suggest that mean global temperatures will increase 2 to 5 degrees Celsius during the 21st century. That increase is not expected to occur uniformly throughout the globe, though. As has been true during the past 50 years, changing circulation patterns may cool some places and may warm others. Rainfall is likely to increase in some areas, but decrease in others. We can draw a few conclusions from a single observation that May 2015 was Earth's warmest May on record. So you have lived through the hottest May on record. But in fact, May 2015 was the 361st month in a row that was warmer than the 20th century average. And this data is telling us that the world is warming. And you could see again from this map, this is the relative increase in mean annual temperature. And again, you could see that temperature is warming very much up in the north. It's also warming a lot in the Amazon because of deforestation. So what are going to be the effects of global warming? So let's first talk about them on an ecosystem level. Evolution is one response to global change, but given the pace of climate change, many populations may not have time to evolve and adapt. Species such as the ring seal are at risk of extinction due to habitat loss. Ring seals rest on the sea ice, conceive beneath the sea ice, and give birth upon the sea ice. Then they excavate snow dens on the surface of the sea ice to shelter their newborn pups who can't swim for long periods of time like the moms can. These dens keep the young warm, but the sea ice is dependent upon sufficient annual snowfall. Because it's getting warmer, this winter season is now getting shorter, and so there's not enough time for the sea ice to form properly. And so it's getting harder and harder to find good ice for these mothers to raise their young on. So organisms that live in very cold climates are losing their habitat very quickly. And there's going to be nowhere for them to go if all of the ice melts. For some species, migration to more suitable habitats can ensure their survival. And if you look at this figure here, you can see that as temperatures have increased, jack and red pines have migrated northward to their current distribution. And you can see, so for this particular pine tree, they need a particular temperature. So they've moved further north. So the seeds that disperse further north are the ones that survive. Other species, such as hickory, will expand their range due to the warming climate and have greater areas to have in their habitat. Another problem is a change in reproduction cues. So for example, if we look at this picture here, the bird called a great tit uses sunlight data to know when to lay its eggs. So they get a cue from the day length, they lay their eggs, and then their offspring are around during the time where caterpillars are abundant, and so they have enough food to feed their young. But because of climate change, many insects depend on temperature to hatch and grow. And so there will be a shift in when these particular caterpillar species are around. And so if the great tit still relies on the length of the days, which won't change, her offspring will not have enough food to eat because their prey had a shift in when it should reproduce. Also, temperature-sensitive sex determination is going to be a problem, like we talked about with the sea turtles in the beginning of lecture. Oceans are especially vulnerable to this climate change. Increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide is having an observable impact on organisms in the oceans, not least on coral reefs, which provide hotspots of biological diversity in the marine realm. Coral reefs are the rainforests of the ocean. The Great Barrier Reef is visible from space. It stretches more than 2,000 kilometers along the northeastern coast of Australia. A global diversity hotspot, the reef is a habitat to over 1,500 types of fish, more than 4,000 kinds of clams and snails, and many, many other species. Today on the Great Barrier Reef, throughout the Caribbean and elsewhere, corals are dying or bleaching. Bleaching is indicated by the white skeletons of dead corals, which you can see in the picture. And this occurs when their symbiotic algae called zooxanthellae that feed the coral abandon their host, sentencing the corals to death. An increase in seawater temperature appears to signal the algal exodus and also it facilitates the spread of infections that also can kill the corals. The increasing in carbon dioxide levels also may be a greater long-term threat. About 1/3 of the carbon dioxide produced by humans during the past century has been absorbed by the ocean. This means that there is less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to trap heat, but carbon dioxide also dissolves in seawater to form carbonic acid. Increasing the abundance of carbon dioxide in the ocean causes the pH of seawater to decrease, which is a phenomenon known as ocean acidification. In the past 50 years, as the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has grown, the pH of the surface ocean has correspondingly dropped by 0.1 units, which might not seem like a big deal, but that can be very catastrophic for many of the marine organisms living in the ocean. So the pH scale is logarithmic, and so a 0.1 unit drop represents an increase in hydrogen ions of about 30%. So that's going to be very challenging for organisms who live in the ocean to deal with these changes in pH. So here's our first question for today. The figure shown depicts the arrival of migratory hummingbirds at their spring breeding grounds from 1880 to 1969 in the map on the left, and from 1997 to 2010 in the map on the right. Which of the following statements reflects changes over approximately the past 130 years in hummingbirds and their utilization of the spring breeding grounds? Is it A, hummingbirds are arriving at spring breeding grounds earlier in the past 20 years or so than 100 years ago? Is it B, hummingbirds have expanded their spring breeding grounds in the south, areas depicted on orange in the map? Is it C, hummingbirds are no longer breeding in the easternmost region on the map, the area marked in green? Or is it D, in the past 20 years, hummingbirds are arriving at spring breeding grounds later than they were 100 years ago? So pause the video and answer the question below. All right, another question. In general, what is the relationship between a country's ecological footprint and its overall standard of living? A, as the standard of living decreases, the ecological footprint increases. B, as the standard of living increases, so does the ecological footprint. C, it depends on country. In developed countries, the ecological footprint and standard of living are positively correlated. In developing countries, they are negatively correlated. Or D, it depends on the country. In developing countries, the ecological footprint and standard of living are positively correlated. In developed countries, they are negatively correlated. Pause the video and answer the second question below. Okay. So now we talked about the human impact on the carbon cycle, so now let's talk about its impact on the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, because humans have also influenced those. Through the use of fertilizers and other activities, humans add about 140 million tons of fixed nitrogen to the biosphere each year. This amount is comparable to that contributed by all microbial nitrogen. The majority of this fixed nitrogen is created industrially by reacting nitrogen gas and hydrogen in the presence of a catalyst to produce ammonia. Most commercially produced ammonia is further processed to nitrate that will then be spread across fields as fertilizer to increase crop production. But only about 10% of the nitrogen added to the croplands ends up in food. A watershed is an area of land where surface water converges. So you could see two different watersheds in the picture below. We have the Mississippi River watershed on the left, which is very expansive, and then the Ohio River watershed on the right. Much of the nitrate fertilizer leaves the fields as surface runoff and travels through the watershed to rivers, which flow into lakes or the oceans. So this agricultural runoff adds nutrients of nitrogen and fertilizer, which are typically limited in ecosystems, to these aquatic habitats in great amounts. The added nutrients lead to a great increase in the populations of algae and cyanobacteria in a process called eutrophication. These algal and cyanobacterial masses grow exponentially because of the added nutrients they have to feed on. Eventually, they sink to the bottom where heterotrophic bacteria feed on them, which fuels high rates of aerobic respiration. The bacteria can completely deplete the oxygen in the bottom waters, with potentially catastrophic consequences for animal life on the seafloor or lake floor. So this eutrophication often leads to the decrease in the dissolved oxygen concentration, or hypoxia. And so because these organisms are dying because of lack of oxygen, we have a decline in species diversity, because aquatic organisms are suffocating, creating dead zones. In the Gulf of Mexico, nutrients leached from croplands and transported down the Mississippi River result in a dead zone of oxygen-depleted bottom water. This dead zone expands seasonally from the mouth of the river west towards Texas, covering an area about the size of New Jersey, and you can see it from outer space. Several hundred dead zones have been identified in coastal oceans around the world, and many are expanding year by year. And you can see in this picture all these dead fish that have washed up on shore because they were in a dead zone where it was hypoxic, there was no oxygen. And you can see here in our Mississippi watershed, all of this bright green is all farmland, and all that fertilizer used in that farmland, that 90% that doesn't stay on the field, runs into the Mississippi River and into the Gulf of Mexico. This is so bad that you can see this from space. So here we have the coast of Texas into Louisiana, and you can see all of this is all fertilizer runoff, and this is the dead zone that is formed. And it's about 6,000 to 7,000 square miles. It is ginormous. So this poses major issues for people who have fishing as a livelihood, for example. Having a lot of dead fish washed up on your beach hurts tourism. So not only is this bad for the environment, it's also bad economically for people who rely on the ocean for income. Another clicker question. Nutrients from croplands are carried by the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico. If nutrients are good for growth, why are scientists concerned about this nutrient influx? A. Higher productivity may support greater numbers of sharks. B. Higher productivity may support greater diversity of phytoplankton species. C. Higher productivity may result in increased respiration by bacteria feeding on sinking algal material, depleting oxygen within Gulf waters. Or D. Nutrient runoff depletes nitrate, which cannot be made industrially. So pause the video and answer the third question below. All right, so now let's look at other issues of environmental health. Biomagnification is the magnification of the concentration of toxicants in an organism caused by its consumption of other organisms in which the toxicants have bioaccumulated or built up within the tissues. So if we look at this figure here, we're looking at DDT concentrations. And in the water, it's spread out and it's at a very low concentration. Then you have your smallest organisms, your primary producers, and they're taking in water. And so in this example, and so they're taking in this DDT toxicant. but it's still at relatively low levels. Small fish have to eat many zooplankton to survive. So every time they eat one zooplankton, they're getting a small amount of DDT ingested. But because they have to eat many of them, they're ingesting many organisms with DDT in their body, and so the concentration increases. Large fish, likewise, have to eat many smaller fish to survive. So the more small fish they're eating, the more DDT they're getting ingested into their body, and so it increases. Our top predators then have to eat many large fish to survive, and therefore the top predators have the greatest bioaccumulation of toxins in their body compared to other organisms in the food chain. And so this buildup of these toxins through the trophic levels is called biomagnification. In 1962, Rachel Carson released a book called Silent Spring. It examined the use of dichloryl diphenyl trichloroethylene, DDT. You do not need to remember the full name. DDT is fine. The title refers to Carson's warning that pesticides might kill so many birds that few would be left to sing in the springtime. In birds of prey, DDT was found in high concentrations, and it caused major population declines because the eggshells of the birds were very thin, and when the parents would sit on the eggs to keep them warm to incubate them, they would crush the eggs. So birds such as the bald eagle populations significantly declined. Because of this book and because of the studies that showed how bad DDT is for organisms, including humans, it was banned for use in the United States in 1973. This study in Silent Spring caused Congress to establish the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, which now works to decide which chemicals can be used and which ones cannot be used in the environment. And if you want to watch a video that shows just how ubiquitous the use of DDT was, I highly suggest that you watch the video in the link below. Another threat to our environment are invasive species, and they're one of the most insidious causes of habitat loss. Invasive species are non-native species that spread widely and rapidly, becoming dominant in a community and interfering with the community's normal functioning, so they're messing up the ecosystem. Removed from natural constraints on their population growth, such as predators or diseases, invasive species can expand dramatically when introduced into new areas, and they have major negative consequences on native species and ecosystems. So some of the impacts that invasive species have is they do increase biodiversity because you're adding a new species, right? But on the flip side, it can reduce native species populations and even cause some species to go extinct, so they can reduce biodiversity. They can help degraded ecosystems recover from human impacts, but if left unchecked, they can have major impacts on ecosystem services. It's been estimated that 49,000 invasive species have been introduced into the United States. Many of these provide food or pleasure, such as ornamental plants, and only a few have escaped into natural ecosystems. So, for example, if you have a potted plant in your house that's a species that's not native to this area, it's a non-native species. As long as you don't plant it outside and it doesn't go wild and spread throughout the area, it's okay. Here's two examples of major invasive species in the United States. Kudzu is a plant imported from Japan to help stop soil erosion, but now it covers more than 3 million hectares in the southeastern United States, displacing native plants through competition for space and resources. And so you can see in this picture how bad it can get if people aren't working to control it. It can totally cover everything, including all the trees in this area. The zebra mussel, which is in this picture, is a European bivalve that hitchhiked to the Great Lakes in the water that is stored in the bottom of a cargo ship. It has multiplied dramatically in its new habitat and displaced native species, clogs intake pipes to power plants, and has totally decimated the ecosystems of the Great Lakes. As human activities lie at the heart of threats to biodiversity, humans can make choices that will help us to preserve and protect the natural world, not just for all the plants and animals that live in the world, but for our future generations of humans as well. Conservation biology addresses the challenge of sustaining biodiversity in a changing world crowded with humans. At the broadest level, most biologists would hope to sustain our shared heritage of global species richness, which is a tall order on a planet increasingly marked by human activities. Biologists have identified about 35 biodiversity hotspots, which we talked about in a previous lecture. These areas are a high priority for conservation efforts. Evidence shows that biodiversity provides important ecosystem services, that is, services provided by ecosystems that benefit humans. So you can see here, these are different ecosystem services provided by our planet. We have flood regulation, source of pharmaceutical and genetic resources, foundations for human infrastructure. We get our construction material from the environment. We have our nutrient cycling, climate regulation, water and soil contamination reduction, carbon sequestration. So the earth provides a lot of services to us. So it's important that we maintain a good planet so that it can continue to provide these services. So conservation biology is looking at how to conserve animals that are endangered or vulnerable to extinction and areas so that we have habitats for these organisms to live. Conservation biologists have a diverse toolkit for confronting threats to biodiversity. Some programs focus on individual species, targeting specific threats that have reduced or could reduce populations below sustainable levels. So for example, programs to protect elephants and rhinos. We are going to talk at the end of the lecture about a successful breeding program that happens at the Cincinnati Zoo. One key component of targeted conservation efforts acts to conserve many species at once, protecting and restoring ecosystems. So by trying to make one species protected, it actually ends up benefiting the entire ecosystem. Reserves protect habitat area, provide land to restore degraded habitats, and provide managed areas with which overexploitation can be eliminated or minimized. For reserves, bigger is always better. Rounder square areas function much better than elongated or fragmented areas because it provides a wider area for the forest species to roam. But it's important to include corridors to provide routes for migration from one reserve to another. So you can see here are some existing parks, but these parks are very fragmented. So by providing corridors where animals and plants can move from one protected area to another, allows species to be able to access all these different areas. And it also is important for species that tend to have large migration patterns or very large ranges for their particular habitat. So here's an example of a corridor that was made more so to stop elephants being hit by cars. But this is a corridor in Mount Kenya National Forest that they built underneath a road, and so elephants can migrate from one protected area to the next and do it in a safe way. All right, another clicker question. A biological reserve that is designed for a single species is an important tool in maintaining biodiversity because a reserve, A, that is designed to protect a species will always be maintained as a reserve, B, will not change over time, so all species will be conserved as long as the reserve exists, C, will generate income when people visit to see the biodiversity protected in the reserve, or D, that is designed for a single species will also protect other species in the reserve. So pause the video and answer the question below. All right, one more question. Which of the following trophic levels will have the highest concentrations of a toxin in their bodies? Is it A, primary producers, B, primary consumers, C, secondary consumers, or D, tertiary consumers, or E, the concentration will be the same across all trophic levels. So pause the video and answer the question below. All right, so I told you I would talk about a successful breeding program that happened at the Cincinnati Zoo. So these are pictures of Sumatran rhinos. They're one of the most endangered animals on Earth. There's less than 80 individuals found throughout fragmented rainforests in Southeast Asia. A captive breeding program was established in 1984 to try to save this species from extinction. The first Sumatran rhino calf was bred and born in captivity at the Cincinnati Zoo in 2001. Since then, 2 additional calves have been produced. In order to help return these rhinos back into the wild to try to save their species, these 2 rhinos have been sent to the Sumatran Rhino Sanctuary on the island of Sumatra. And the first rhino born in captivity, Andalis, has actually fathered 2 offspring at the Sumatran Rhino Sanctuary. So there's one example that happened in our area to try to work to save a species from extinction. That's it for this lecture. Congratulations on finishing Bio 151 lectures for this semester. Post any questions you have on the discussion board, email me, or come to Zoom office hours on Tuesday. I hope you all have a great day and good luck on your finals.